If you are fear of complex composition, I just want to know that you are not alone. Today, I would like to share some tips on how to paint a complex composition in watercolor. Tip number 1 is choosing reference photo. A good reference photo is when the subject appears under the sunlight in the morning or afternoon when the sun is on an angle about 30 or 40 degrees. This specific time produces softer light and create great casting shadow and make the subject appear more three-dimensional. Tip number 2 is plan your painting. Some painting you might feel that you need a color study first before you start the final painting, or you can plan to paint the background first or the subject first. Other painting might require to paint which part of the painting first and which part next and last. I always start my painting with light wash, milk or tea consistency. As you may already know that watercolor is easier to build up layers by adding more colors while it's still wet or when it's dry, but it's hard to remove. If you want soft effects such as those tiny veins on the flower petal, you need to use wet on damp technique. By adding tiny stroke when the paper is close to drying stage. Some part of the painting might require clear and crisp edges, or it's also known as hard edges, such as the casting shadow on the flower petal. In this case, wet on dry technique is required, and patience is essential because we need to wait for it to be completely dry before we can add the casting shadow. But if you are like me, I don't have much time, so I usually tackle other areas of the painting while I wait for some area to dry. The pigment that I use for this painting is Urulent Hue, Permanent Rose, Indigo, and Winsor Violet by Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolor. Usually watercolor has drying shift, which means it will get lighter when it's dry. But it's vary from one pigment to another. This is why working in layers is very important for watercolor because it's impossible to achieve full saturation in one layer, especially when you try to paint realism. By using multiple layers also help to create depth for the painting. I usually choose my pigment even before I start my pencil sketch, and I will try to mix and matching the color to my reference photo. If you are like me, you love lifting technique, then you might want to do research on your pigment before you start buying or start using them. Because some pigments are easier to lift than others. Usually the non-standing paint are easier to lift than the standing paint. And you might want to do your testing between transparent, semi-transparent, and opaque paint. And for some artists, maybe the super granulation paint is the most suitable. In this painting, I use Winsor Violet because its transparency offers distinct advantages, creating luminosity and depth, especially when you add layers to your painting. And it's also mixed well with other colors without creating muddy color, which I try to avoid in my petals. It's also excellent for glazing technique. What is more, it allows light to pass through the paint layers and creating glowing effect, which I try to achieve for my painting. If you are a beginner, I recommend to start with something small and simple, from 5 minutes watercolor to 10 minutes. That's when I first start using watercolor, and then when I get more understanding of the medium, I start with something like this. This one is a practice painting. The original painting was a lot larger and it's already sold. Or a simple still life like this one. Simple birds, and then when I get more familiar with birds, I start a bit more complex compositions. Besides skill, you also need inspiration. So paint with what you inspire. Even it's complex, you still manage to do it. Like something like this. This is a larger painting, complex composition, but I loved it. I always love to paint lotus, and this is my first one. You can find most of this painting in my Spring Inspirations playlist. I lay down on the floor of my two beginners painting to my complex composition painting, so you can compare between the sizes and the complex in compositions. And it took me about 2 years to get to where I am right now, but I had to admit that I don't have time to paint every day. Sometimes I skip months, 3 months, until I pick up my brush again. I give the same attention to every part of my painting, doesn't matter if it's background or focal point. You probably ask why shouldn't the focal point receive more attention than the background? Yes, the focal point should receive more attention than the background. That's to the viewer's eye. But for me as an artist, I need to give attention to everywhere of the painting. For example, I pay attention to those petals in the background to make them look soft enough so that the flowers in the foreground could stand out. To repeat my point, I give the same attention but I aim for different result. I give attention to the background is to make it soft and blurry, but the foreground is to make it sharp, crisp and clear so that it stands out from the background. An easy way to get soft background is to wet the paper first and use wet on wet technique. Or sometimes I use wet on dry technique and then I use clear water to wet the edge of the petals to get soft edges. When we have decided where our focal point is, it's easier to make our way through the painting. We know exactly where it needs soft edges and hard edges. And we will also know exactly where we need to apply a few layers to receive a full saturation and where just one layer is enough. To me, creating focal point and composition is the most important things for a painting. No matter how well I paint the subject, if my composition is wrong, the whole painting looks off and I would have to abandon that painting. Usually I use the 1/3 rules to set my composition, but this time that I actually break the rules. So for the 1/3 rule, you actually need to divide your painting into 3 parts like this, from vertical and horizontal. And the intersection that I circle in red, that's where you can place your focal point. In this painting, I choose the top right corner for my focal point. Usually I like to add birds, butterflies, or insects to my flowers to create my focal point, as well as create movement for the painting. Here is where I want to insert detail as much as I could and create some hard edges, but not to the point to make my painting look hyper-realistic. Not saying that hyper-realistic isn't good, but that's not the style that I'm aiming for. Having said that, don't afraid to add your style into the painting. After all, it's your own painting and you are the artist. You have the right to decide what is good for your painting. Most of the time, I don't follow my reference photo exactly. I simplify my painting by combining shapes or eliminate some unnecessary detail. Sometimes I remove some shapes out of my painting just to make my painting look less crowded. I love to apply my design theory to my painting. That theory is less is more. For example, in this painting, I remove some of the background flower out completely. There are a few advantages when I remove some of the background flower out. Number 1 is to make my painting look less crowded. Number 2, I could get contrast in color of the foreground colors and the background. An easy way to create background is to use cool colors. Beside those pink flowers in the background, the rest of the background I use cool colors so that it appears further in the distance. Normally I keep my background simpler than this, but because this one has lots of foliages in the background, so I want to share the technique that could make the foliage looks more sophisticated but easy to paint by using wet on wet technique. But for those leaves that in the foreground, I use wet on dry technique and also charging technique. With watercolor, it's very important to keep your dark pigment and the details to the last minute. As a beginner, I usually make mistake by going too dark too soon. As we all know that watercolor is not easy to remove, that's why we need to keep our dark to last. Plus, when we paint the dark color on top of the light color, it creates a clear and crisp clean edges. However, we cannot paint light over dark. We only could achieve this result by adding white gouache or white watercolor paint as a highlight. But I normally love to use my negative painting to get my highlight. It's the white of the paper. Unless sometimes the highlight is too small to achieve by negative painting, and then I will need to use white gouache. So this is the darkest dark of my painting. Here again I adding it and keep it to the last minute. And then I went back to add some more foliages to my background using wet on wet technique. My number 11 bonus tip is to embrace your mistake. When you can accept that mistake is only a part of learning process, and then you feel less fear to start your complex compositions painting. I hope these tips are useful to you in some way and somehow give you courage to start your complex compositions. If not today, maybe one day. Thank you so much for watching.